This is the Ramana Maharshi 40 Verses on Reality Satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and to deeply inquire into the self. Know yourself and be always free and at peace. Welcome. I'm Richard Clarke, and I'm hosting this satsang. I'm a seeker like you, and sharing what we love. I've been blessed with years of deep teaching and practice that I bring to this satsang. This week's reading from 40 Verses on Reality is verse 39. And these are Ramana's words. Only so long as one considers oneself bound do thoughts of bondage and liberation continue. When one inquires who is bound, the self is realized, eternally attained, and eternally free. When thought of bondage comes to an end, can thought of liberation survive? These dualities exist only in our mind. When a duality as seen as one and thereby disappears, where did it go? Was it ever real? When the snake in a rope is found to be a rope, where did the snake go? Dualities like liberation and bondage appear as pairs of seeming opposite. Without one of the pair, where is the other? Ideas of bondage and liberation are one of these pairs. None of these pairs exist in their own rights. They all depend on the light of consciousness for their apparent existence. They further depend on the mind for the idea of opposition. What opposition can there be in the self when you know yourself as one, where there is no other? Who is bound? Enquire, and you will find that this one does not exist. You can ask, who knows this bounded one? And see that this is yet another objective idea. It is known. Who is the knower? This inquiry takes you beyond an imagined doubter. Doubt is just another idea. Who knows these ideas? Who am I? Now, a practice note. What happens when the dualities you think are real disappear? Where did they go? They were never real to begin with. When you see that the snake was only a rope, where did the snake go? When you see that the seeming individual does not exist, what happens to that idea of an individual? Now, we have some videos for today, and first is Swami Adyasakti, who is also talking about this same verse, verse 39. There's his picture.
Namaste. Welcome to another, almost the last episode of Uladu Narpadu. Next to last, penultimate. So now we have a very interesting verse. Only so long as one is a madman, that is, devoid of true knowledge, feeling I am bound, will there exist thoughts of bondage and liberation. But when one sees one's self by inquiring who is the bound one, in other words, who am I? And when thereby the ever liberated one, the real self, alone remains as the established truth. Since the thought of bondage cannot remain, can the thought of liberation remain? See, this is the real reason why actual enlightened people never claim to be enlightened. And it's also the reason why enlightenment is not an experience. So, okay, let me explain those in detail. An actual enlightened person is not thinking, I am enlightened. Because there is no thought of enlightenment when one is actually enlightened. When someone attains liberation, moksha, freedom, they're not anymore thinking of myself, my body, my mind, my name, my form, my activities, my possessions, my relationships, and so on, my activities. They are, well, they're not really thinking at all. There's no need to think because everything is just obvious. So in other words, an enlightened person, an actually enlightened person, does not need to take a position. One of the sayings by the Buddha that I really love is that the Tathagata has done away with positions. That means he no longer is attached to name and form. He doesn't anymore think of himself that I am a Buddha. That's a ridiculous idea. But he still tries to help people, and of course to do that he has to use conventional language. But if we were to really just be who we are and not have to compromise with the consensus reality, we wouldn't need to speak at all. Everything is just so clear. I remember back in the days, I was on a padayatra, which is a walking tour in South India. We had come sort of southwest out of Hyderabad, and we were crossing some really backcountry areas. And we were traveling with two ox carts and an elephant. Seriously. And we came to places, villages, where there had never been a motorized vehicle, especially a car. Maybe a couple people on motorcycles made it back that far, but that's about it. So in these villages, of course, nobody spoke English. Yet, we never had any problem communicating. Just sign language and a few grunts, pointing a lot, was enough. Why? These people were not attached to words. They were living in the old ways, so they were much more enlightened, much more receptive, much more understanding. They had time. So when I look at people today, I think they're mad. They're just mad. They're attached to all these names and forms. I am this, I am that, I am so and so, I am this person's husband or wife, etc. And the people in the Enlightenment game are not immune to that at all. They're fully caught up in it, just as much as ordinary people. Don't kid yourselves. And because of that, they can be very easily exploited and deceived. And believe me, there are people making a lot of money on that. For example, there are workshops, retreats, seminars that you can go to. They're very pricey. And when you go there, well, let me explain what happens in terms of a medicine show. In America, back in the old days, you had these medicine shows. And they would go around with a couple of wagons and a big tent. And they'd set up. And they had different themes, you know. Some of them were Chinese, Oriental medicine. Some of them was black soul medicine. Some was Native American, Indian type medicine. Some were Christian and so on. But they all had one thing in common. They were phony. And they used psychological tricks to make people have an experience, a healing experience. Huh? So one of the tricks is they had shills. A shill is a person who pretends to be a member of the audience, but they're secretly in cooperation with the operator. Huh? The operator will get up there and give his come to Jesus speech. Huh? Whether it's Jesus or whatever, you know. He's going to encourage people to come up and get healed. So, of course, the first people who stand up and come up and get all excited and act like they've been healed and so on are the shills. And then, of course, at the back of the tent, there's all these tables with medicines for sale. And some of them had some actual content, and most of them didn't, though. They were just phony. Bottles full of colored water. That the expression show bottle comes from that. Because in a pharmacies in the old days, they would take the patent medicines and display them in the window. But of course, any medicine that's exposed to light will lose potency. So they put colored water in instead. And these are called show bottles, as opposed to the actual bottle of medicine. So these operators, these medicine show operators would sell show bottles, literally, in the back of the tent, and also figuratively, up front, on the stage. So they would bring people up, and the people would pretend to be healed and get all excited and on. And then ordinary people would come up, and they would use a technique called love bombing. Love bombing is a very well-known technique of psychological manipulation, which is used by fundamentalists, healers, and showboaters of all different kinds. And it's still going on in the so-called Enlightenment business today. How does it work? Well, everybody has what's called a ruin. The suffering, the problem that ruins their life. And astrologically, it has to do with the position of Saturn in their chart. So if you can find out what somebody's ruin is, if you can find out, whether by astrology or by questioning them, what is the problem that's ruining their life, then you can very easily manipulate them by pretending to solve that problem. So in a medicine show, you have somebody coming up, and they're very shy. And then the operator will question them, find out their ruin, and then just love bomb the heck out of them. Right? And usually what happens is they break down, they emotionally become very vulnerable and suggestible. And so then the operator can suggest to them what they want to believe all along, that you're enlightened, or you are the self, or any of, whatever the particular mood is. If it's Christian, well, you found Jesus, right, and so on. And then the person has this terrific feeling. Well, of course, they just emotionally unburdened themselves, which is, by the way, the cause of 90% of illness anyway, emotional stress. And so they feel like, oh yeah, I'm enlightened, I got it, wow, And so chalk up another successful medicine show. This is going on. And people are actually paying a lot of money to be deceived like this. So what is the takeaway? Enlightenment is not an experience. Experiences are all external. Even experiencing one's own mind is actually external because the attention is focused outside. Something different from oneself. Actual enlightenment has to do not with what is seen externally, but with the seer, the one who sees. That's why the technique of turning around the light or reversing the flow, sometimes called different names, in The Secret of the Golden Flower is so powerful. So what this means is that enlightenment does not happen in an experience. Yes, there are certain experiences, and they're actually rather predictable, on the way to enlightenment. But actual enlightenment itself is a realization. It is a change in point of view. It is an understanding of who I am, what I am. And this doesn't happen in a big flash. It happens in maybe dozens or hundreds of little realizations until one day they all add up. And you go, oh, I got it. This is it. This is what they're all talking about. And then boom, 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 all the pieces fall into place. So don't be fooled. Sadhu Om makes a note here. When one knows oneself by inquiring, who am I, the individual who is in bondage, one will find that the individual or ego is non-existent, and that the real self, which is ever liberated, alone exists. Since bondage and liberation are both mere thoughts, and since all thoughts depend for their seeming existence upon the first thought, which is the ego, the feeling, I am so-and-so, name and form. When the ego is found to be non-existent, the thoughts of bondage and liberation will no longer be able to stand, because they have no place to stand. Just like yesterday, we were discussing the Buddha's sutra, where he says when the light comes through the window and there's no wall, there's no ground, there's no ocean, where does it land? It doesn't land. There's no place for it to land. Similarly, there's no place for thoughts of bondage or liberation to stand in the absence of the ego, in the absence of the I. Nobody can do this for you. I don't care how much money you pay them. I don't care how psychologically skilled they are at emotional manipulation. They cannot make you enlightened. You are already enlightened. You just have to see it. And I don't mean see it in the sense of an experience. I mean to realize it in the sense of a change of point of view, which you have to do yourself. Nobody can do it for you. That's why I talk and talk and talk, to try to give you the sense of what enlightenment really is and who you really are. I know who you really are. Confirmed. Om Tat Sat. Om Hari Om.
And now we have my teacher, Nome, and he is speaking of attainment of the ever attained.
The self ever is, just as it is. It is only itself, and being never undergoes any kind of modification. It is unborn and indestructible. Consciousness, which is being, does not move. Its nature is never altered. Bliss is of this formless being consciousness. It is ever attained, ever established in its own nature. Inquiry reveals the knowledge of the self as it is. In the course of spiritual practice, generally one of two views is taken up regarding the self and in the attainment of the realization of the self. One view is that of establishing oneself in the self, steadily so. The other view is that of attaining a state in which the self remains steady in oneself, in one's own mind. It is worthwhile to examine your own practice to see if you hold these kinds of views. The former is obviously higher than the latter. If we want the self conceived as an experience or a state to remain steady in our minds, in our experience, we have to ask ourselves, what is this mind in which it would be steady? If the knowledge of the self is to be brought into the life, what is this that is called the life? Whose life? As long as that whose life, whose mind, or the nature of the mind, were left unexamined, how could the desired steadiness, that goal, be reached? The cause of the unsteadiness is not the fleeting nature of the truth or of realization, but the unreal and mirage-like, utterly lacking in solidity nature of the mind, or the one in whom the truth is supposed to abide. If the former view is taken up, there is the idea of establishing oneself in the self. But how is that to be accomplished unless an inquiry be made as to who it is that is to be established? Who is it that now stands distinct, subtly or grossly so, who will become established in the truth? Whether we think the truth should be established in us, or that we should be established in the truth. What is necessary is to know the nature of oneself. Self-realization, therefore, is, we could say, the attainment of the ever-attained, and does not involve establishing the truth in oneself, or oneself in the truth, as well intentioned as these might be, but the realization of one's only identity as that solitary, indivisible existence, which is ever established, the eternal reality. So while we may loosely speak of realizing the truth within, dissolving the mind therein and becoming steady, or abandoning oneself and dissolving into the truth, and thus becoming established in the self. What realization truly is this indivisible abidance in that as that. No one departs from the reality of the self. No one joins the reality of the self. Therefore, there are neither bound nor liberated jivas or individuals. There is just one self, pure existence, consciousness, bliss. For the realization of this, therefore, the Maharshi has advised to inquire, who am I? And thus know our singular, irrefutable, undeniable, unalterable nature. It is neither here nor there, neither now nor then. It is all that exists, and yet it never becomes an object. It never becomes a subject. It just is as it is. And this is true for all eternity. Therefore, inquire deeply as to the nature of your being or your consciousness. And know it as it is. In this is found the permanence of realization, for that which is unborn is imperishable.
And now let's take a few minutes for inquiry ourselves. Now, just breathe in and breathe out with long, slow breaths. Feel the breath as it comes in, as it goes out. And notice that you exist. You exist, and you know that you exist. Without thinking about it or sensing it, you just know that you exist. And now, investigate within yourself. Ideas of bondage are in your mind. Who knows the mind? Ideas of liberation are in your mind. Who knows the mind? All of these dualities and the ideas of dualities are in your mind. Who knows the mind? Is this knower dual or just one? Who am I? What is the nature of my existence? All right, let's close with a short chant. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Any questions, comments, discussion?
Yeah, that little phrase, who knows the mind? That there can't be anybody that knows the mind.
Mm-hmm. But it's known.
But if the self is only one without a second, and the mind, does it exist?
Well, does the mind exist on its own? Advaita says the mind borrows consciousness. The self is being, consciousness, bliss. And so the consciousness that is reflected by the mind is the consciousness of the self.
Yes. And is the self knowing?
Not by the mind, but is the self not known? Is there any moment that you have not known the self?
No, there's never been. Yeah.
So it's one of these paradoxical statements that,
Yeah.
when you know, it's not a paradox anymore. It's
Yeah.
just,
There's awareness of the mind.
yes, yes. Now, don't consciousness and awareness are confusing terms, and they may be used differently. Now, our friend Adyasakti is specific about this, and he uses consciousness as consciousness of some object. So, consciousness of the mind is consciousness of an object still, and he uses awareness to mean consciousness without an object.
Okay.
And I think for me that's a useful distinction. And it's a
Yeah.
thing that's hard to deal with in language.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you. And it is good to have you here. And it's good to be together.
Yes, it truly is. It truly is. And I hope uh, all goes well, and we'll see Carol the next time.
I hope so too.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will be in touch.
Okay. And let me close out this session today and say to our people in the internet land to thank you for letting me share this teaching with you. This series on Ramana's 40 verses on reality will conclude with the next session. And so, thank you again for joining me, and namaste.
Namaste.